Chapter 1 of Psychopomp Drive. Written by Janeen Leese-Taylor. Read aloud by Skaya Simaru. Chapter 1 You. In all the world, only one thing really mattered to Finley Evans, and that was Rose Daniels. She went by the name Thorn because she said the name gave her more of an air of mystery. "Why would I want to be named after the least interesting part of the plant?" she had stated one afternoon in their shared youth in the middle of Mr. Simmons' art class. The corners of her mouth had curled up in that playful smile of hers, bright eyes crinkled with delight as she had pulled him in for another chaste kiss behind the cover of a half-painted canvas. The name Thorn suited her much more than Rose ever had, in Finley's unbiased opinion. She wasn't just another pretty face destined to blend into the background. She was sharp and witty and brazen, a constant surprise even to those who knew her well, and he felt like he knew her very well. That was one of the reasons why he had decided to propose to her, after all. Soulmates, she had called them. Finley couldn't help but agree. They were destined to be together. It was written in the stars themselves. He tried to keep his thoughts centered on her as he rounded the corner into the shower of heavy rain, tried to use the warmth of her affection to shield himself from the icy chill of the April wind. But sadly, no matter how much he wished she was there next to him, he had to make do with his own limited body heat. He tucked his head down and ventured towards the main shop-lined street with a grimace. The temperature dipped into the minuses, a very unusual feat for this time of the year. It had been pelting down relentlessly for 3 days now, the wetness darkening the color of his navy jacket as he used it to brace against the biting sweeps of wind. The wide streets of Chester gave no shelter from the cold for any of the other passerbys either, and Finley noted the bustling colors of passing umbrellas fighting in his peripheries. A near miss made a woman in front of him blanch, yanking her out-of-control umbrella aside to let him pass. She muttered an apology as she scurried, mouse-like, into the cover of the local Greg's. He raised a hand and offered what he hoped was a kind smile to her, though it was hard to know what smile the wind and cold had beaten into his face at this stage. Hugging in against the sides of the black and white townhouses, the tall man brushed his blonde hair from out of his field of vision, its wet tendrils lashing against his numbed cheeks like a cat of 9 tails. Squinting through the downpour, he could just about see a meter ahead of himself, the streets emptying of people as the rain grew only heavier. Only madmen and the heartsick would brave the elements on a day like today. The sun was peeking over the jagged rooftops of the red brick bank ahead, and he eyed it with vain hopefulness, listening to the aching howl of its old bones and praying it would stay in one piece long enough for him to pass. Below the cover of the building, the homeless cowered in the doorways. They didn't have faces anymore, not since people had stopped looking at them. It was as if the pull of a magnet were yanking the eyes of the shoppers upwards as they passed, the sight of those at their feet too much for a Monday morning. Stuffing his hands into the pockets of his canvas jacket, Finley Evans jogged across and listened for the satisfying clang as he deposited his daily offering, smiling back when the older man in the navy sleeping bag gave him a sleepy nod.
"Afternoon, Finley,"
he greeted. He was missing several teeth now, the whiskers on his chin turning prematurely gray.
"Morning, Elijah,"
Finley returned with a bright smile, crouching down as the people on the street around him swerved to avoid stepping on him.
"Hell of a day."
"It is," he agreed. His accent was once Liverpudlian, but it had since lost some of its power. Now there was a soft twang of something distinctly Welsh beginning to creep in.
"You got an umbrella? I've got 3 here if you need one."
"Thanks, but you'll need it more than me today," Finley replied, taking a peek at the dark clouds overhead.
Want me to pick you up a Starbucks or something on the way back? Warm you up?"
Elijah's blue eyes were crisp and clear despite his years on the cobbled streets. They were the intelligent eyes of a scholar. He had once revealed that he had been a lecturer in a past life. English literature, of all things. He had been well read, the kind of man that had opinions on things. In the end, it had been the horses that got him. The famous Chester Racecourse was at the very center of the city, a hive of high-class living and expensive champagne. It was easy for the rocks there to appear gold to the casual onlooker. No one could blame a man for the first bet, or even the second. It was all in fun, after all. It was on days like this, when the glitz and glamour had faded to cement and tarmac, that Elijah was left with his solitary moments of loss. The bills had racked up, and then the costs of therapists, divorce lawyers. Climbing out of the hole that you dug was harder on days like this, when the rain never seemed to stop. Sometimes the blond man worried that his older companion might die of starvation or decide to take a long walk off a short pier. But the more time he spent with him, the more he saw the contentment that the man had carved out for himself in the world. Like a Buddhist monk sequestered away in a monastery, Elijah had long since given up worrying about the things that he could not control. The sandwich Finley would bring him on his lunch break would mean as much to him as a winning lottery ticket.
"I would never pass up a latte,"
he chirped, shifting to pull himself further into his coveted doorway.
"I heard they've got new flavors now. I would love to try something new."
Finley grinned, bright green eyes smiling too.
"Always the adventurous type,"
he remarked fondly. He could feel a droplet traveling down the bridge of his nose and blew upwards to send it flying. It tickled against his freckled skin and made him want to sneeze. Elijah laid back and rested both hands on his stomach to admire his friend as he stood.
"Speaking of adventures," he started, "little birdie told me that today's the day."
Finley beamed because he had been dying to talk about it. The money had been lifted and was already resting in his wallet in preparation for the most important purchase of his life.
"I've got it all planned out." "I'll bet you have."
The man smiled up at him, a genuine smile filled with lost teeth.
"Still going with that picnic idea?" If the rain ever decides to stop,
the younger man answered, tilting his head back and up to glare at the droplets coming off the edge of the curved roof.
Yeah, it will or it won't,
the prone man said, with an air of knowledgeable positivity.
The thorn will say yes, either way.
Finley's green eyes regarded him with an excited energy.
You think so?
There was a chink of change hitting a cup, and Elijah glanced upwards, waving gratefully at the passing form of a woman as she dropped off her offering. She slinked away with a concealed, embarrassed smile.
I know so,
he amended. Finley wished that he had this man's confidence. He could already feel the butterflies knocking against the walls of his half-empty stomach. He scrunched up the bottom of his coat in his trembling fist.
I promise you'll be the first to know, Elijah. I'll happily be the first to congratulate you, Pop,
Elijah shouted after him as the blonde-haired man rushed back into the morning commute, taking his chances while the clouds had parted. There would be no more stopping to smell the roses today. All he cared about were the thorns. Spotting a gap in the human traffic, he made for it, shapes and colors blending together to form a single connective blur around him as he hurried. Taxis drifted past, heading for the Grosvenor Hotel, and splashed water around his already soaked ankles with a subdued slush. Any other day, he might have been annoyed, but today was the unspoilable day. A freak meteor shower couldn't disrupt the man's thoughts, as focused as they were on his one singular task. He shifted through the abstract painting of the street, trudging onwards in damp jeans and waterlogged trainers. The louder sounds of water to his right were trying their best to be distracting, the hanging plants overflowing onto the pavement below. The smells of cooked pork dodged and weaved around the raindrops to invite his senses, welcoming him to embrace something new and warm for breakfast. He held strong, though. He would not be distracted from his mission. An iron door just ahead complained at him with every gust of wind, and the old man next to it muttered softly under his breath, as if in agreement. Finley swerved to their right and went a little ways down into the side street until he came to the glowing entranceway of H. Samuel's. The jeweler's was plainly decorated with distilled creams and reds, its small door left cracked to let customers know that they were still open, even if the weather suggested that Noah was building his ark elsewhere. Finley pushed where the sign said pool and flushed when the word finally settled in his mind and established its meaning. He changed his approach and was warmed by an overhead heater as he stepped inside, the ends of his blonde hair curling up against his cheekbones.
Sorry about the...
Finley started as he wiped his feet. The woman dressed in black and white approaching from the till area. He felt conscious that he didn't belong in a place like this. His jacket was too baggy, his jeans not quite the right size for his shape, but the lights above made everything shine just right, and his magpie eyes were pulled in all directions despite his nervousness.
You're here for Thorn. You can do this, Finley.
The woman waved a hand in greeting, her smile kind and coffee-fueled. Not to worry, it's only water, she soothed. The tall blonde gave her a grateful smile, pulling his hands out of both his pockets so that he wouldn't appear rude.
Can I get a look at your engagement rings, please?
Her eyes lit up immediately. "Absolutely," she replied, a noticeable bounce infiltrating her step as she walked back towards the counter, the anxious 30-year-old tailing just behind her. "Have you got any ideas for price range? Shape? Color?" The man fished out the little piece of paper from his inside pocket. Luckily for him, it was only a little damp. He placed it onto the glass countertop, smoothing out the edges with only slightly shaking hands. There, in the center of the ad, was a round-edged diamond set into a thin, white gold band. He cleared his throat as he pulled back his hand.
Something like this?
She twisted her head to one side to see the ad from his perspective. We have a few like that one I can show you." She guided him around the side of the clear counter, fingertips running along the gold-toned edges of each of the cases until she tracked down the right one. She opened it from behind with the smooth sliding of a panel, pulling out a tray of rings nestled in navy blue satin. "Any ideas about the size?" she asked. Finley reached inside the little hidden pocket again and slid the stolen ring across to her.
"I took this from her jewelry box. She wears it on the same finger and it's spot on fit-wise. Think you can get an idea from it?"
She nodded and pulled out a silver contraption that looked more like a torture device than something a jeweler might use. She compared the sizes and read off a number and letter that meant absolutely nothing to him, so he simply nodded in response. She eyed the rings before her, the lights making them twinkle as they reflected back in her oceanic pools of blue. The prices here range from £500 to £1,500, she stated, depending on the carats and the quality of the diamond. She glanced up as another figure darkened the doorway, and she gave them another award-winning smile without missing a beat. "I'll be right with you, sir." The man in the door stood dripping on the welcome mat, his dark-colored raincoat glued to his skin wetly. A hood covered the top of his head and down to the center of his nose, shielding his eyes from view. He hovered there unnaturally, never shifting to shake the cold or the rain from his clothes. Finley's green eyes traveled down the length of his arms, and he noted the dark spots that appeared on the ground under the space where the man's hand must have been hidden. The color blended with the carpet, the fabric soaking it in with a deep, unquenchable thirst. He appeared like an omen, the shape he created with his jacket like the shadowy form of a raven. He leaned back to pull the door shut behind him. The pair that occupied the counter space heard the sound of the lock, but it didn't quite register with either of them what it was, or what it might mean. Finley blinked and turned his attention back to the dark-haired woman in front of him, realizing suddenly that she had continued speaking, explaining the benefits of each of the rings that she had laid out before her. The man at the door grunted loudly and raised a hand, something in it catching the light. Finley's mouth grew dry when he turned to face him. Every spark of perception slowed. As he blinked, he felt like he was floating through time like an astronaut drifting in the blackness of space.
"Houston, We have a problem.
He had never seen a gun before, but he knew instinctually how to react to one. There were multiple choices to be made, unconscious ones that his mind and body would carefully select for him in the time it took for him to release his first reactive breath. His body, it seemed, had chosen to fight. He sprang forward. Grasping the blue satin, he tossed it towards the stranger as he pulled the employee to the floor by the collar of her shirt. Finley wasn't sure which of them had screamed. His heart beat wildly as he watched the woman crawl into the cover of the desk, reaching for a button behind the safe that was concealed to all but her. A gloved hand reached over the side of the glass counter and grasped a handful of her dark ponytail, yanking her forcibly upwards, and she squirmed in his grasp, clawing at his hands with perfectly manicured nails. Her eyes were black with mascara-thick tears, the sound of her quiet sobs barely filtering through the ringing tinnitus that was beginning to fill his ears. Under the cover of the hood, the stranger finally moved to look at him, and Finley felt his blood run cold as winter slush. In the barrel of the man's gun, he could see his happiest memories, the wedding day that he would never have, Thorne laying half-dressed in his bed as the Sunday dawn washed across her dark acorn skin. He saw the unpaid bills lying on his kitchen table, the leftover lasagna in the fridge, mundane things that had no end, no resolution. Finley opened his mouth to speak as the alarm began to blare, a .22 caliber bullet lodging between his eyes. At first there was pain and static, and then there was nothing at all. To be continued in Chapter 2.